Welcome to Dear Future, the podcast where we talk with folks at the intersection of art and technology, really exploring how do artists and technical folks learn how to adapt to a post-AI world, both for careers, their own curiosities, their hobbies, and how do we do so while maintaining our humanity in the process.
This idea that everything's been done before can be challenged.
I've been dreaming of a computer like this my whole life.
It really made me think more about how our brains work.
It's not coming from anywhere else. It's only coming from us.
Dear Future.
So with us today is Chris Kenny, the head of product at Deep Voodoo. The company was created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone of South Park in 2020. They went viral after making a 14-minute comedy called Sassy Justice, featuring a deep-faked Donald Trump, Al Gore, Mark Zuckerberg, Michael Caine, and even a young Julie Andrews. They also did VFX on Kendrick Lamar's The Heart Part 5 music video, where Kendrick's face turns into O.J. Simpson, Nipsey Hussle, Kobe Bryant, Kanye West, Will Smith, and I think a few other people. The last news that I saw about Deep Voodoo was when they secured $20 million in funding to help them develop their deepfake technology, cost-effective visual effects services, and original synthetic media projects. Thank you, Chris, for being with us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
One question I have is, Deep Voodoo made a bunch of sort of splashes at the end of 2022 when they secured funding. I'm curious, as the head of product, you are sort of in the weeds of the development of these different tools. What would you call them?
I guess if we had to name the thing, it's deepfakes is what the term is used most often internally, but I think it's a little problematic. To a lot of people, it means something explicitly pejorative. It means misinfo or disinfo, and so I think trying to be sensitive to that makes me want to come up with a different term, and so we've kind of glommed onto the generative AI term. As obviously doesn't describe exactly what we do, but it describes kind of the industry we're in now as a whole. We're working with creative clients who don't just want to narrowly focus their efforts on one particular effect or something. They want to talk about the whole project, and so we've looked well outside of the deepfake technique. So we can guarantee ourselves that our work is going to look very different next year or even next month. It seems important to me to develop as future-proof as possible, both workflows, from an artist's perspective, and then tools too. And I really think a lot about where is this all heading? What does it look like to be an artist working with AI in the future? And I don't think it looks much like it does today.
I want to get more into the bigger philosophical questions of artistry, but before we get there, creating a bit of a foundation for what your job is and what you do on a daily basis, because I think there is a lot of mystique around what a deepfake is, what it does, and in many ways, to many people, feels like an incantation, a magic spell that is cast to make one face a different face. And I would say, based on the history of Deep Voodoo, right, with the Kendrick Lamar video, with Sassy Justice, you've made these big splashes, taking names of import and celebrities and turning them into a bit of a comedic farce, which is delightful. Also, even with Kendrick Lamar, sort of creating a new art form out of trading personalities and identities. I think there's so much space for questioning artistry within it, but I would also like to demystify what that process looks like for someone like you. What is it that you're focusing on, just to give a little bit of context?
I'm kind of at the intersection of the artists and their work and their needs and the engineers and their work and their work product. We've got almost a 50-50 mix of engineers and artists. The artists are the kind of stakeholders. The tools are made for them. And so I make sure that the engineers are represented and met, and try to be a bit of a translator in between the two of them, and then still spend a lot of time with my hands on both writing code and on the shot work, or on the box is what VFX artists would call it. And I think that's helpful too. But the artists, they're really unique, trailblazing a new kind of role. They are artists first and foremost, and they think about their work from kind of a creative, emotional standpoint, but they have to be super plugged into the tech. So when they are training a model of a human face, they're having to build a data set and manipulate hyperparameters and monitor training. And all of that is to get a creative output. So we've built a very flexible, close to the metal tool set for them that allows them to really easily make some change that might make for a totally different model architecture. And so they do a lot of experimentation like that. And so that's what I think I'm interested in empowering. I'm imagining this AI artist of the future who's not just using off-the-shelf models. They're building their own, and that's the only way you can kind of continue to push the bounds. That's, for me, is going to be the future, where the models belong to everybody. People can train up their own. There's as few barriers as possible to people, and they're not just sitting and praying for a large company to release a new feature for them. They're going to go out there and they're going to build it themselves.
It's like the spirit of the pioneers, innovative, energetic, sort of, I'm not going to let someone tell me what the parameters or limitations are of the craft that I want to build for myself. They're very much like building the road that they walk as they walk it.
Exactly. It's super exciting for me to see how empowered people feel who are, prior to this year or last year, they wouldn't have thought of writing code or getting into machine learning or anything like that. And it's gotten so easy that they're feeling like they can do it, and they are doing it, and they're having success. And they're thinking about not just their workflow, but themselves differently. Like they feel powerful. And that's awesome. It's like one of the ways in which I'm an optimist is like seeing friends have a reason to learn to code, or at least get into the guts of these things and figure out how to bend it to their will and create something beautiful. And that to me is just like a objective good.
It's so interesting, too, in this era of fear, shock, anger, grief around how AI is disempowering artists, that in the same breath, you are surrounded by so many people that are actually feeling the opposite, and how disorienting that might be to sort of be getting a message from the outside world that showcases this collaboration as one that is inherently fraught with dangers and disempowerment. And actually what you're seeing is a sense of artists taking control of their craft in a totally different way. From your point of view, does that make you sort of feel like there's a soapbox you want to get on and shout the good word to the people? What is your approach to being in LA and seeing the ways in which so many people are sort of speaking out against the use of AI? What is your take, and how do you approach that antagonism?
I guess I'm totally on board with us as a society deciding what we want. That's kind of what it's all about, is we get to decide. And what's cool about this moment is that it's kind of risen to the top of a lot of people's awareness, and we're actually having the conversation now. And there are certainly components of it that are scary, and there are certainly potential negative outcomes here. And I think it is great that we're having the conversation now, that it's like on the tips of everybody's tongues and top of mind and stuff, and that we get to try to hash it out now and just imagine a bunch of potential futures, identify scary components of them, do our best to come up with solutions or compromises at least to try to avoid them. I don't think we exactly got that chance with social media. It's like kind of only possible for me to think about what this technological revolution is going to do in terms of what past ones have looked like. And so, social media strikes me as like a good analogy to be thinking about, like a good way to frame this. Social media / smartphones feels like to me like the last big disruptive technological revolution we had, but it felt like it happened just slow enough that it didn't let people flag it and say like, let's have a talk about this. And I think we all just ended up boiling. And I don't believe there's evil people out there. I think everybody wants the best outcome. What leads to bad outcomes is just not having the conversation. We're having the conversation now with AI. That's why I'm an optimist about it, is because it's not happening in secret. Everybody's seeing it happen. We're discussing legislation and stuff for it. I think some of it's going to be misinformed or misguided or something, but the worst thing we could be doing is not thinking about the future we want and how AI fits into it. And that might look different than how I'd imagine it, but so many people are engaged in the conversation now that it feels to me like we're headed in a direction that many people's voices are going to be represented in the outcome. And so that seems great to me. My personal opinion that, I'd get on the soapbox about is to not let your fear get the best of you. Certainly like voice concerns about potential negative outcomes, but when I see conversations involving how it's going to kill us all and we're going to need to like bomb data centers, I feel like that's not super productive. There's a kind of fear that is not going to help us wrangle this. That's only going to end up being divisive. My perspective is that this is not too dissimilar from other really disruptive creative tools. My lens is very much a creative one, how it's used in art media. It doesn't feel too dissimilar to me from, the way VFX has progressed over the last few decades. Going further back, it doesn't feel too dissimilar to me than like the introduction of the camera and like what that did to fine art. And of course, all that stuff was disruptive. But isn't it wild to think that some fine artists were decrying the camera as like kind of the end of art? And now we like rightly recognize photography as an art to itself. Fine art still exists, painting still exists. They got to kind of react and respond to it, the fine artists and painters, and either fold in their newfound perspective about the world or react against that and say, like, it's not about accurate perspective and I want to totally break down perspective. And we got a bunch of really cool art in that thrust. And again, like the best way to look at this is by way of analogy, in my opinion. So like, let's look at kind of historical disruptive tool introductions. And could we imagine the world any different? Would we want it to be any different than it was today? I wouldn't say so. So it feels to me like we're always going to kind of figure out how to make the best of this, and art is never really about one thing. It's about expression, and this seems to me to empower way more people to express themselves, really lowering the barriers to people getting involved in art. It's probably going to result in a real shift in tastes and style and stuff. I think people are going to get real sick of photoreality, and we're going to have the same kind of like rejection of that. I think the camera represented like that milestone of figuring it out, of like perfectly recreating reality. And then we got this awesome like rejection of that. And like, let's explore some destruction of perspective and destruction of reality, and what's going to be like post AI art. I don't know, but I'm so excited about it.
It's actually something that I really wanted to get into, which is thinking about the youth of digital media and how cinema was invented 100 years ago and the camera 200 years ago. There was a birth of a new artistic style, a new school of creativity. And right now we're sort of witnessing the technology being created, and therefore by necessity, the craft and the artistry is coming along with it. And I've read so many articles about this sort of age of combinatorial creativity. And the lecture I gave last night at USC was about generativity. What is this world that we're entering into as artists, in which we're going to have to rethink our own creative process, because what is being required of us through the tools is a rethinking of how we create. And so as someone who is really at the edge of the technology's creation and also interfacing with the artists that are using it and learning to manipulate it, what are the things you're most excited by in what you're seeing and how you're seeing them explore? There can be sometimes so much emphasis put on the product being a perfect representation of what one's idea is, but actually the mistakes are sort of a part of the interesting novelty of creating in this collaboration with AI. For you, what is the exciting part about also their process? Not just the fidelity of what it is that they're trying to achieve, but their creative process and how they're engaging with these tools as creative spirits.
Having spent, 15 years in VFX, sometimes really struggling to get out of the tools just what's in my head, and seeing other people struggle the same way. I think a lot of the time spent in the seat doing this kind of work was this struggle that felt unnecessary, the struggle with a tool just not working the way you thought it was. In the abstract, what we're trying to do is put the image in our head onto the screen. Things that slowed that process down and didn't inform the process, didn't make the process better. Seeing those kind of barriers melt away, I think, is the most promising part of these like AI tools. There is, though, an important part of the struggle. Part of that is being engaged enough with a craft that you are understanding each single component, and sometimes the only way to do that is to like just get down and dirty and do it yourself. In the case of visual effects, that might mean like animating something by hand or painting something frame by frame. And many visual effects artists know that experience of looking at something, and you've got the approach of like generating a super complicated 3D environment and doing a sim, or just thinking, could I just paint that frame by frame and get there faster? That part of the struggle, I think, is valuable. And I think there is a danger of losing that if you find yourself in the position with like an amazing text-guided diffusion model at your disposal, and you can just say, imagine what this looks like. And if you're just happy enough with the way it looks, you've gotten the image in your head onto the page, hopefully. But if you just kind of settled for whatever came out, then you haven't really engaged with the artistic process. And that is totally fine, because a lot of people don't want to do that. I've talked to people who do not call themselves artists, love using tools like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or DALL-E or something. They love that there's a super low barrier way for them to engage with art. That's awesome.
What is the artistic practice now using these tools?
I've seen people who probably spend as much time as they would have without the tools now that they have them, probably because they have been engaged with the artistic process for so much of their lives. They're not happy with the way these images come out. They think like, okay, that's a great starting point, but how do I get it better? And so that might mean doing hundreds of iterations of one of these diffusion models, or it might mean generating them in layers and then going into a paint application and compositing them together or painting on top of it. This AI stuff will not kill that workflow. But what's, I think, valuable to think about is like, what is the analogy for getting in there and painting frame by frame? Or what is the analogy of mixing your own pigments? There's a value in going through those processes. And so how do we not lose touch with that like real craftsmanship? And I think there's totally a way. One thing I think a lot about is breaking these large models into smaller components so that you at least get to picture a graph of how one of these models might work. And so there's some stable diffusion workflows out there. Comfy UI is a really good one where you can visualize a graph of how the whole thing works. And so you can see that like, okay, here's where the text gets turned into this embedding, and here's where this embedding goes into the model to like kind of guide the diffusion process. And here's where a latent vector comes out of that and gets upscaled or something. And that stuff I find really exciting because it seems to like perfectly project onto the typical artistic process, just with radically different and more powerful tools.
It's like computational tools that are added onto your palette, and all of a sudden things that would have generally been like color and texture and light. I worked in cinematography for a really long time. I'm imagining the technical aspects of building a really beautiful frame are essentially transmuted into like computational models that you're then applying as like filters through which you see your craft.
It lets you break the image into its components. So you don't just say like, hey, computer, give me a beautiful image of like a street scene at the golden hour with people carrying grocery bags or something. It allows you to say like, I've got a scene, let's change the grocery bags into suitcases, or imagine a slightly different time of day, or like the street needs to be like slightly more reflective. And the kind of monolithic approach often ends up completely changing the whole scene. And that's going to be really, really frustrating for a lot of traditional artists to like lose the things they really liked about the scene in order to like kind of manipulate one parameter. And so I think we're just scratching the surface at what's going to be possible when we like blow these things apart a little bit more and expose way more controls to people. I think there's probably a concern now where a company like Midjourney might worry about there's going to be a lot of confusing controls in there, and people, they're going to not know what they mean. And it's possible to make a really horrible looking UI and user experience with this stuff, but it's also possible to do it right and expose this stuff and let people learn intuitively. Nobody starts out, sits down and cracks open Blender or Maya or whatever their first time and knows exactly how to start modeling. They're going to like figure it out, and they're going to learn a lot of new concepts about 3D geometry. Break it open for people who like want to get their hands really dirty and let them experiment, because I think the only thing that's missing is like that good user experience. The motivation's certainly there.
There's the way that the music industry also changed when Ableton was introduced, when these different DAWs were introduced, plugins and this like world of extensions and creating all these different audio effects in ways that you would have been able to, because you'd have to record it into a tape and go into this and have everything sort of be like manual. And now all of a sudden there's this whole market for these different effects and ways of essentially knob turning these different dials. Like, what does this dial do? And you only really figure out in experimentation. Questions I have for you as you engage in this intersection of technology and art. What makes a good AI artist? What makes a good generative artist? And what is it that you look for in people that are using your tools that you're like, oh, that's a really exciting use case? And what is it that you get very pumped up about that piques your interest for an audience of creatives that are trying to understand what taste is in this new world, that are engaging with AI as a new genre that they don't fully understand?
I think what makes the best artist in this space, and this probably is going to be true about any space, is the willingness to struggle, the willingness to be really bad at something and not get discouraged, because, everybody starts out not knowing a damn thing about this stuff. And this is, about as complicated a tool as we've made yet for the purpose of making art. When you don't particularly care about the results you get there faster than ever before. And if you do, it's the reverse. It's more complicated than it's ever been before. And so if you want to be an artist in any space, you just need to be willing to engage with the process of learning and be really bad at something and keep coming back to it day after day after day, and you'll improve. And this gets to like what's exciting part is you'll figure out ways to use it that was never imagined or intended by the people who coded it up or who wrapped it up into a product and sold it or whatever. You're going to come up with something people have never seen before, and that's super exciting. That is something I see happen at work at Deep Voodoo all the time. It's so fulfilling for me to see an artist either show off something they've done with one of the tools that we didn't expect, or even present an idea or identify a bug to the engineers that the engineers just like did not see or did not understand. Even though they might not have the right language for it, they intuitively know, like they have intuited something is wrong there. It's awesome to me. They didn't have to read a book on deep learning. They use the tools and something felt wrong to them. Knowing that that's valuable, I feel like is really empowering for people who want to get into this and are afraid that like it's moving too fast or the tools are too complicated or I don't know how they work. It doesn't matter. If you start using them and you're not afraid to fail and you're not afraid of making something that looks bad, that's great. It's a good signal, I think. If you are using a tool and you're like disappointed in yourself or disappointed in it, that means you've got an idea in your mind that you haven't achieved yet. And if you just stick with it, you're going to get there. That kind of grit is probably important for every type of artist, but maybe more so now, especially because the tools suck right now. They're really, really bad.
It's so funny to hear you, who are developing it as the head of product for a company that's creating sort of the cutting edge deepfakes of the world, that you yourself are also admitting that the products suck. And I'm curious, what sucks about them?
It's just early. Building a great user interface and like great design is really hard. I think it's easier to code up a new type of strategy or loss function or something like that than it is to expose that in a beautiful natural way and an intuitive way to the artist. And that's going to come. It's happening. Like, we're well on our way to beautiful, intuitive user experiences. But just the fact of the matter is where we are today is innovations happening in the software, just outpacing the ability for us to like wrap them into nice user experiences. And so right now we are really reliant on our artists toughing it out and like getting through writing configuration files and stuff like that. And we're looking forward to the day where they don't have to, where they've got intuitive user experience that also doesn't tie their hands in any way. Those two are kind of at odds. It's like a really difficult balance to strike, to have a great, easy to use, beautiful tool that also lets you get into the nitty gritty, into the weeds as much as you want to and as you need to. And I think it'd be a tragedy if we had to give up too much of the latter there, or too much of the ability for artists to really tinker, because I think there's so much out there to discover still, some like awesome applications and some really wild types of effects that if we just make sure we've given the artist the controls they need and should have and can have, that they're going to find. Those things seem a little bit in conflict to me. We're doing our best to solve them. And I think, again, we will get there, but the pace of change today means it's really, really hard to keep up.
So for you, as you're building this tool, I'm sure you see so many different versions and iterations of the same kind of thing. And I'm curious what cuts through the noise and what keeps you excited to keep looking at more of these. You said there's sort of these weird effects. What are the novelties that you are encountering, if you don't mind sharing what those kinds of things are? Like, what are you developing? What are you seeing that you're like, oh my God, that's so wild, and I'm so excited for the world to see that?
The most exciting thing for me is to less directly talk about the particular attributes of an image and talk about things like the emotion or the feel of something. What's awesome is that vision models, language models, in the far too small amount of introspection and interrogation we've done about what they've learned or how they've learned it, we've discovered that they learn these semantic concepts. Like, ask one of these vision models to imagine you a scene that feels like tropical or something. They'll do it. And then you're going to have to ask yourself, like, well, what did I mean by tropical? Why does it look the way I expected it to? Like, what is tropicalness? Like, what is the essence of that?
I love the idea of the essence of tropicalness. It makes you question the essence of everything, the essence of lightness. It's like the unbearable lightness of being. Like, what are the sort of platonic ideals that are the representations of this idea that we think is objective and true, but actually is just sort of a series of characteristics?
That exactly right there is probably the most exciting thing for me about this, is that one, we get to work on that plane, right? We don't need our director to say like, all right, well, tropicalness is this, and decide what it is, and then work on like placing the palm trees or making sure there's like water lapping at the base of a coconut palm or something. Like, no, that might not be it. But the other component is we get to have this conversation. We get to say like, what is the nature of this emotion, like of this feel, this vibe or something that we're having? I've worked with directors and stuff who'd tell me to make a vista of clouds more sad. What does that mean? Like, what does a sad cloud mean? That was one of the most fulfilling parts of my job, I feel like, previously, is being given the license to like go with that, to say like, all right, it's now my job to figure out what makes a cloud sad and to make this cloud as sad as possible.
Based on your own taste, right? Like, how do I make myself feel sad by looking at this cloud? And instead now, rather than asking yourself, what is my impression of sadness within this substance, you're actually asking a model. Is that the difference?
Yeah, and there's, obviously an interplay in both. You might discover that its notion of sadness, at least by way of the images it's generating or the activations you see when you feed it images of one type versus another, like maybe that doesn't align with yours, and you get to like learn something about my notion of sad clouds at odds with the rest of the world, because maybe you could say this model, having been trained on the whole of the internet, is kind of the best representation of the rest of the world. That's really exciting to me. It seems like the best opportunity we've had yet to look at ourselves from the outside. We've just dumped all of our like angsty thoughts and feelings, all of our photography writings on Twitter and Reddit and 4chan to like great literature and stuff. And it's actually learned some pretty interesting things about us, I think. And I'm dying to know more about us by asking this kind of like alien intelligence. What do we seem to think of or feel when we talk about sad clouds or tropical scenes or stuff like that?
What have you learned about yourself in working with these tools? What are the discoveries you've made about how you see the world while using these tools? And also, what have you discovered about the world through your insights and interplay with this collaborator?
They're called neural networks because they're kind of modeled on at least our understanding of how brains work. I think that's another really interesting thing we'll learn about ourselves, is if they can't achieve like AGI, or if they can't function as human brains actually do, well, then we've learned something already right there about us and how we're different than this model of a human brain that we call a neural network. It's been really really interesting to think of them as children for me, to like watch the like nieces and nephews to like children in my life learn stuff and be also engaged in the process of training this other little tiny brain, in the case of these models. It's really made me think more about how our brains work, about how we learn, about assumptions we make. It's made me think a ton about free will. We've got this artificial brain. It's only learned what we've taught it. Do we get mad at it when it like generates a bad looking image? No, we've not exposed it to the correct breadth of experience about the world, and we need to fix that. We need to train it better. We need to let it learn better. It makes me ask myself, well, what's different about humans? Like, how could we ever fault a person for being the way they are when like they didn't have any control over their training set any more than this model did? It was born into this world. Like, we constructed this little world around the model as like the world is kind of constructed around us, and it's like they're the product of this environment we've let them live in, as are we. And so that's led me to some pretty profound thoughts and feelings about what it's like to be human. And it's just been by way of reflecting on these things, which again are like our current state-of-the-art best attempt at making little human brains. I don't know if I'm crazy for thinking and feeling that stuff, but it seems to me like we should be having these conversations in like humanities classes and stuff. I know some people are, like they're using these models to like interrogate literature or music or something like that, in kind of the same way we talked about interrogating sad clouds or tropical scenes or whatever. We can take it a step further and like actually think about them not just as models that will faithfully generate a tropical scene, but like as little models of us, without trying to like project too much onto them. Like, what can we learn about ourselves from interacting with them?
What are the running questions that are happening in your mind about yourself in relation to these models, these little brains?
One thing that occurs to me is we think a lot about the boring parts about optimizing these things and making them fast. And so like, what are the most salient parts about this? Like, if we're having it learn stuff beyond what's necessary, then that's like kind of seen as a waste. And so it's made me think a lot about, is there such a thing as like a wasted experience or something? Like, can you waste time? Does it take up space in your brain that could be used for something else? Like, do you have to make room in your brain for something else?
It's really interesting also thinking about how our version of success is in so many ways so limited and constrained by a particular end product. There was this TED Talk at TED.ai that I watched. He created his own computational language.
Stephen Wolfram?
Yes. So hearing his talk about the Wolfram language and this notion of understanding the world from a very different point of view, what does it say about us when we can interrogate our idea models? It makes me question, in the optimization of these tools, these little brains to fulfill specific functions, what would be the outcome of sort of letting them roam free and create the kinds of things that they want to create? For us, we wouldn't understand it. I love this concept that like, if we just let an AI sort of create something, or in these sort of large iterative models where you're just seeing it make idea splatters, and for us it doesn't mean anything, but what does it actually mean to it? And it creating its own sense of meaning with ideas that we can't comprehend because we're seeing through our own two eyes. But what is the meaning that's being created for these models for themselves? At what point do we sort of stop having access to the potentialities that are embedded within it if we don't see the mistakes as also a part of the magic? Last question. Can you give me a little bit about how you came to be in this position? Because there's a lot of people asking this question, like, how do I get a job in this? What are the jobs that are available? I personally believe there's a lot of different career opportunities. And part of the magic of talking with someone like you is you come from a different background that has placed you in this position that's optimized for your brain and your way of being in the world. But what was your path to get here?
Yeah, I definitely didn't will myself into it. In retrospect, it looks like the path was obvious, but at the time I didn't feel like I made any really directed decisions in getting here. So I went to art school in San Francisco. I was intent on not working with computers at all in my career. I was really interested in visual effects as a teenager in high school and probably earlier. My grades really suffered because I spent a lot of time Photoshop and stuff like that and not on homework. I had an opportunity really early on to visit a visual effects professional. It was up in the Bay Area where I was living at the time, and I thought the work was really cool. But as a career, it looked miserable. First of all, the guy was already there on the weekend when we were visiting. That was his life, and he kind of worked in what felt like a cave. And I was just like, I'm happy to keep computers as a hobby, but not as a career. I was really interested in games and cinema and storytelling and stuff, and so I went to art school with the intent on pursuing that in a way that did not involve computers. Of course, after a few years of that, I found my way back to computers and was like, all right, this is what I'm doing. I clearly have an interest here. And so I studied some visual effects there, but found my way into a couple early visual effects jobs and kind of learned on the job, and made my way to LA to pursue a job that ended up being permanent, I guess, because this was 17 years ago now. So I worked in VFX for 15 years and touched most aspects of the pipeline because I ended up in a position where I was kind of overseeing like the construction of the pipeline and like integration of different software while still trying to spend a lot of time on the box. And it was 2018 somewhere. I was working on a project with a digital human where we were trying to create a photoreal digital human for a Marvel feature. Our digital human looked great. It was a Thor digidouble. He looked amazing, but he could not talk because we knew that was like too far. That was like hitting the uncanny valley phase. We knew we couldn't do facial animation for a photoreal human character. Thanos and Rocket Raccoon and stuff, they were on the same production. We were animating Rocket, and that's fine because like that was not gonna trigger that uncanny valley feeling, but a human like Thor would. And it was like while we were working on that, somebody came into my office with their phone playing some YouTube videos of some like deepfake hobbyist work, and we all looked at it and like slapped our foreheads and went like, how are these random folks not in the industry, not with like unlimited resources at their disposal like us, how are they doing better facial animation than we could hope to do? And I was just kind of obsessed since then. It was at a moment where the company was kind of struggling that I was at, and we didn't have a ton of work coming in, and so I just spent like all my time at work digging into this stuff, trying to learn linear algebra, read the code, but also like try to figure out how to get compelling looking images out of it. And we had clients coming and asking, we've heard about this deepfake stuff, can you guys do it? And we tell them no, because it's like kind of a scary black boxy thing. We couldn't control it. We couldn't guarantee good results. And so we never really used it in work. And so I kind of put it down, but like kept my ears to the ground and kept my eyes on the space and kept tinkering until the company I was at after that got approached by Matt and Trey from South Park because they wanted to make a movie with deepfakes as a conceit. You know, like they wanted it to be front and center, like deepfake the movie, basically. I jumped at that opportunity, started working with them, and I think we did one camera test, like one day of photography, and then COVID lockdown orders shut down that production. But they kept the team together, and I was able to join full time because it just felt to me like the pre-AI, at least visual effects pipeline and a post one, and I wanted to jump over as soon as possible and like start kind of embracing it and rethinking the entirety of the workflow in the pipeline. That was like 3 years ago, and it's been really validating to see that it wasn't a stupid decision, you know, that like kind of everybody else is on board with this. Everybody in every visual effects studio is scrambling to figure out how to plug AI into their workflows. I think I was at the right moment at the right time to like be kind of hit over the head with this thing that just seemed like inevitable. The choice for me was like make the decision now or later, but it's going to happen. And rather than be on the kind of receiving end, sitting and praying for like Adobe or Foundry or Autodesk to like drop some awesome tool on us, like let's figure out how to make it because the promise is there, obviously. So it's not going to be something we can buy right now. Let's make it. And I think I still feel like that. I still feel like there's way more potential out there that has yet to be realized than there are like products that exist for artists to use. And so we're engaged in making them now.
That is incredibly exciting, and I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you for chatting with me about this, both the technical side and also your history and your philosophical explorations, because for me that's really interesting, is like as creatives, as also technical people, how do we adapt to this very changing world and learn how to remain connected to the things that make us creative artists and curious seekers and students, while we are also having to be sort of forced to adapt maybe a little faster than we might have previously desired. Thanks for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Dear Future. This podcast is made possible by Echo Bend Pictures. We are recording at their studio. We're very excited to be working with them. Thank you so much for having us, Echo Bend.
Dear Future.